Each of us has a unique career story to tell. For some, these fly high like rocket launches. For others, they're more like the game of chutes and ladders, with advances and setbacks along the way. Either way, we learn countless lessons from these experiences. And that's what we put into the spotlight here at Career Sessions Career Lessons. Join discussions featuring a variety of guests sharing their stories of ups and downs, as well as the secrets of their success and what drives them to continue moving forward. We break down the tools and resources that will help you establish your dream career and realize your professional goals. Here's your host, J.R. Lowry.
Hi, I'm J.R. Lowry. This is Career Sessions Career Lessons, which is brought to you by Pathwise.io. Pathwise is dedicated to helping you live the career you deserve, providing coaching, content, courses, and community. Basic membership is free, so visit Pathwise and join today. Today, my guest is Eric Eichmann. Eric was recently appointed as the CEO of ESW, and he brings over 20 years of leadership experience in technology and e-commerce disruption to the role. Prior to joining ESW, he served as the CEO of Spark Networks, a global leader in online dating. And before that, he was the CEO of Criteo, a global leader in commerce marketing. Under his leadership, Criteo achieved remarkable growth, surpassing market expectations for 19 consecutive quarters. Eric also held positions as the Chief Operating Officer at Living Social, the Chief Operating Officer at Rosetta Stone, a Senior Vice President of Ad Operations and Technology at America Online, and a senior manager at McKinsey. He holds a master's degree in computer engineering from EPFL and an MBA from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. Eric, welcome. Good to catch up. It's been a while. Looking forward to having our conversation, and thanks for being on the show.
Well, thank you very much, JR. Appreciate you inviting me.
Absolutely. So you've got a pretty new job, new CEO gig. You want to fill us in on your new role?
Yeah, so I'm CEO at ESW, formerly eShop World. I started about 6 months ago. So in August last year, the company is about 1,000 employees in 4 main cities. So Dublin being the main center, New York, where I reside, being the second one. Then we have Madrid, and we also have Lowry, which is in the northern part of Ireland. So an exciting opportunity. ESW. Most people would know it. It's a B2B business. We enable e-commerce companies or brands to sell their wares and their goods across the globe. We help them go to over 200 countries. So that's exciting. And our mission is to make worldwide e-commerce made powerful, made simple. So that's kind of our.
So how did you end up in this role? Was it through a recruiter?
Yeah, it was a recruiter that contacted me. I think part of it had to do with my experience in Europe with Criteo, which I'm sure we'll talk about. I just, that was a great experience. And so people know me in particular for cross-border kind of sort of global opportunities that span Europe, US, and other countries. So that's how we found.
And what made you want to take the role? What was it that appealed to you?
E-commerce has been in a lot of what I've done in the past. Interestingly enough, I also, this is part of the job because, we are a software company. So, but at the same time, we enable these brands to send goods all over the world. So there's a shipping component that we connect to. And at the very beginning of my career, 2 years after, so my first job after engineering school was in freight forwarding, which was shipping. So that had a little bit of an appeal, I think, behind. But really, it's a great opportunity. What we call cross-border commerce is growing at 25% a year. The industry is still to be defined. So the end game is not known yet. So that was interesting. And, there were elements that I had sort of worked on before, like the fact that the companies in Europe, the biggest market or a big market is the US. And so all of those things sort of made it attractive to me.
So how are you finding it so far?
It's good, as it happens. So I'm taking over from the founder. The founder had sold the company to a joint venture of 2 large corporations. And so, he had been there a couple of years. As that happened, he wants to go and do something else. He's an entrepreneur. And I come in, I have to define sort of like reignite the team, if you will, sort of change the culture, sort of define new initiatives. All in all, it's been terrific. It's been very productive first 6 months, and the future looks good.
Good. It's got to be hard to follow in the founder's shoes.
Yeah, it depends because I've done this a couple times. So in the past at Criteo, I was CEO after the founder took the chairman role on the board, and he remained very involved. So that was a little bit harder because he had certain assumptions. So making changes was harder, right? Because he would challenge a lot of the changes because things, when he ran the company, things worked a certain way and they worked well, obviously. So that was harder. In this case, I think it really depends on the personality of the founder. In this case, he really has sort of giving me the reins. Initially he helped me and wanted to make sure he wasn't giving his baby to somebody that would not take care of it. But now he's taken a step back. So I think it's much easier. He's still on the board, but I have to call him and ask him questions. He won't sort of what happened in other companies. People would still talk to employees. The founders would still talk to employees. He's really out of the picture. So it's actually working quite well because it feels like a true CEO role where there's no interference wouldn't be the right word, but no sort of like bias that's brought into the company. So I'm able to run it on my own, if you will.
Yeah. And you don't have the listed company challenges this time around.
Well, part of the opportunity, and this is public information, is the company would like to take PSW public. And so I think more than the challenge of being a public company, which I've done a couple of times before, is more sort of like getting the company up to be in shape to be able to have the option of an IPO. What I would say is in that process of getting the company in shape, there's always, when you take over a company as CEO, there's always challenges, opportunities, things you have to do to sort of reshape the company to do well. And if in addition to that, there's a public element to it, it just takes a lot of time away from you to do the things that sort of drive the business. I think more than the financial markets pressure is just a time allocation that you have to dedicate to that takes away from running the company. So yes, you're right. I mean, I think in part not having the being a public company does help.
It is, as you say, it is a big time draw. I mean, other than thinking about what are our earnings going to be this quarter, are they aligned with the street's expectations? You go out, you talk to investors, you speak at investor conferences. I mean, it's definitely a big consumer of time for public company CEOs and sometimes, the other C-level staff and those C-level leaders in those companies too.
Yeah. And I think, in addition to the time it takes, it also, obviously, you give guidance, you want to meet the guidance, and you have to explain. And if there are opportunities or changes that you want to make that are in the interest of the company in the long term, not that you can't do it as a public company, but it's an additional burden to explain all of that and tell the public markets what you're doing, why things are potentially changing and all of that. As a sort of, we'd say private company, but as a company that's outside of the public markets, it's actually easier to do those things. Yeah, you do have to go through the board and explain it and all of that, but at least you sort of have to, it's easier to do those changes, those parameters and those considerations of what does the market think and, who do I need to go and explain and all of that is not there.
Yeah. So you mentioned culture a few minutes ago. To what extent are you, I guess, trying to adapt yourself to the way the company has operated under its founder and the culture, and where are you looking at making those changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think any company that's successful, in this case, obviously, ESW is a successful, very successful company, has many elements that have worked well in the past. So I think when you start a new role like this, you always have to sort of look at what has worked well and why it has worked well, and make sure you don't sort of start saying, last thing you want to do is not be humble and come in and think you know better, right? So you have to understand that when you come in, and then you have to understand the challenge or the opportunity that's ahead of you and figure out what things need to change. So I've been in many environments, in many cultures. So I think from that perspective, I'm actually, I can listen and understand and adapt. In the case of ESW, when I arrived, we need to integrate an acquisition that had not been integrated, and turn it into one company. So there was a challenge around culture because there were two different companies. And so bringing it together was one of the challenges. We did that in the first 6 months. So that was an important one. And then the other thing is the founder sold the company, obviously great company, but there was, I would say maybe the agility and the excitement that existed pre-selling the company wasn't the same there. So there was a need to really reassess the culture and get employees engaged again. So we went through an exercise with the senior management to redefine the mission, redefine the values. Very important there in redefining the values was figure out what was sort of keeping us from being as successful as we could be. And so that was a great exercise because that was done with the team. I had particular opinions about things, but ultimately we, in January, so a month ago, we had this big event where we sort of unveiled, if you will, the new values and all that. They were very well received. And so I think to a certain extent, what we've done is keep a lot of the sort of grounding that has made the company successful and redefine a set of values that some of them require changes in behavior, right? Not everything we did in the past is going to be successful in the future, but kind of help us go to the next challenge and what looks like a great market opportunity. So I think in this case, more than in other companies like Criteo, we'll talk about there, the culture was actually quite strong and well defined, and tweaks needed to be made. In this case, I think we need to sort of like kind of track a new course in terms of the culture of the company, and that's a process, right? By telling people this is the things that we care about and the things that are going to makes us successful. That doesn't mean that it changes, right? We need to incorporate in how people work and all of that. So that's we started the first step, which is defining what we want to do. Now we got to make sure that we make that change happen. So we're in the process of doing that.
Yeah, I think when you come in as a CEO, I've seen it happen. I haven't done it personally, but there's the organization, there's a bit of a natural lift that you get, just by virtue of the fact that there's a new leader. And if you manage that transition right, and you respect enough of the past, but you get people, the voices that maybe have been quiet about what they would like to change, and there's always those things that people say that they would like to change. You can find that balance and kind of get everybody with you, and also just sort of breathe new life into the organization.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised how aware people are of the things that are not working. So,
sure.
And you get the benefit as the new guy in town coming in there's an expectation that you're going to do things differently. So there's an acceptance from people. Okay, we're going to do some things differently. So I think there's a bigger predisposition, if you will, to change. And so that facilitates the task when you bring somebody new. I do think that you don't, you have a little bit of a honeymoon period where, people accept things, but you can't let it sort of last too long. You need to sort of do some of the changes early on to make sure that people sort of say and understand that that's part of what's going to be the new course. If you leave the things the same for a year, you don't change anything, people will fall back into old behaviors. So I think that was why this was an important part of my first 6 months, if you will.
Let's go back a few years, just a few years, to when you and I were classmates in McKinsey Chicago office. What do you remember from your time at McKinsey? What did you learn? What did you take away?
It was interesting because I had been an engineer, and when I went to business school, there was a whole new world that I didn't know. I knew sort of computers, and I was in the freight forwarding industry, so I had a very sort of limited set of experiences. And McKinsey really opened the door to a whole new world of experiences. I was an engineer, so numbers, sort of fact-based analysis, all of those things were right. But how you brought that to a management setting, not just in school when you're in classes in business school and things like that, but just how you apply that to companies was a key learning, right? That's kind of the basics of consulting, and McKinsey does a very good job at sort of making sure that you get formed on that end. The second thing that I found, and I think it's clear to me now that it was even like a few years after McKinsey, is just the ability to synthesize, findings and present it in a way that tell a story that you can sort of get all stakeholders sort of to understand it is super important, right? So just get the board, the employees, the markets and all of that to understand the story around what's the opportunity, what are your strengths, what are you going to do to get there. I think it would have been hard to just, you can get there, but I think McKinsey kind of accelerates the ability for you to think about it that way, because you're presenting to CEOs and they need to sort of understand the story quickly. They don't have time. Yeah. And so I think that's another thing that when I think about my McKinsey experience, that was something that I found very, very helpful. And then the last thing is just because you get experiences with companies that, they're going to pay sort of big dollars for the consulting advice from McKinsey. So they put you on tough problems. And generally coming up with a strategy answer is maybe half or a third of the answer than to really make it happen. And this became very clear to me afterwards. And McKinsey, not as much, because we talked about it, we put it in the decks potentially, but then executing it was harder. It's just putting all the elements together. You have to think about the process, you have to think about the people, all of that needs to fall in place. And, execution, a great strategy. I think execution is much harder to do. A great strategy, you can pay for it potentially, but then, executing it is always the harder part. And I don't think that became clear to me until sort of I went into operating roles after McKinsey. Yeah. So I think, we would joke around as consultants, we came up with the great thing, but they screwed it up. But, it is really the harder part of operating a business, I find.
Oh, absolutely. And it's also more fun. Like, I think about when I left McKinsey, I went to Fidelity. I got put into an operations strategy role. So, it wasn't like a line role per se, but it had a heavy dose of, let's develop a plan for how we're going to evolve our operations, and then let's go implement it. And I remember being about 12 months into that job thinking like, this is about as much fun as I've ever had at work, because we were in the throes of the implementation. It's the things you never got to do at McKinsey, because it was just too expensive to keep a consulting team around to do all the execution work. And at some point, obviously, you've got to wean yourself off of them.
Right. And the other thing that you don't necessarily appreciate is like McKinsey and consulting firms and these environments sort of value very conceptual people. So, if you can tell a good story, not that those things are not important, they are, but sort of do good analysis and all of that. Those were the things that were valued. And once I got into operating companies, sometimes you have people that were not very conceptual, but they got it done. And so those people were super valuable, right? So, and that was not, I didn't really appreciate that as much when I was at McKinsey. It's just having operators. They don't need to sort of think about big strategies, but, they have something to get done and they get it done and they get it done the right way. And they're sometimes sort of are better people or leaders than these conceptual, very sort of sophisticated thinkers. So that was also something that was a bit of a learning after McKinsey. But anyhow, McKinsey was a great, I thought about it this way when I left business school. I'm like, okay, I'm going to learn on McKinsey, and everybody understood it that way, right? So a lot of people thought it's a great way for you to get experience very quickly and have the fundamentals of thinking about companies and what senior management kind of issues are, or challenges, opportunities are. So
how'd you end up at AOL after that? I don't remember.
So, interestingly enough, I was in McKinsey. I met my to-be wife, Tatiana McKinsey. She went to study at INSEAD in France, and I went with her, and I was at McKinsey in France, which sort of made me work in different countries, in Switzerland, in Scotland, and then in Paris. And so I ended up working on industrial clients mostly, very interesting projects, evaluation project, a transformation project, a strategy project. And when we came back to the US, we went to the Washington, D.C. office, and sort of I ended up working in the late 90s, so 97 to 99 or so, on industrial clients, transformations and all that. And at the same time, we had the sort of the craziness of the internet happening. That's what I was excited about. I just remember the weekends, the last thing I wanted to think about was the industrial clients, and I would just read what was going on in the internet and how sort of things were being redefined and the potential of it. And McKinsey did not do as much tech work back then. And when it did, everybody wanted to be on it. So I had a good friend from business school that was at AOL, and he said, why don't you sort of come and talk to us? Maybe there's something that you'd like to do here. And I did. And they offered me a role, and I decided, okay, why not? This is, it's as good a time to jump into something different. I think for me, it was the right decision because I was not enjoying as much. I enjoyed the people at McKinsey. The stuff that we were working on was important, but it just didn't get my blood flowing, if you will. It just didn't get me excited. So, and AOL was at the center of the world back then, right? The center of the revolution. They were growing like crazy. And so I joined, I remember sort of the weekend after July 4th in 1999. It was the heyday. Things were going crazy.
Wait, was that before or after they bought Time Warner?
This was before. It was 6 months before.
Okay.
And so when I got there, I remember I was invited when we were at AOL. It's crazy. We'd go from one meeting to another, and it was always different issues. And it was always about defining where sort of different companies, how they were going to sort of adopt digital and how they could use AOL to get their digital strategy going. So it was super exciting because there's all interesting stuff that was going on. I remember my boss would tell me, okay, you're in charge of this. And I would go and be in all these meetings in my first few weeks, and I would come back with a deck. And I'd say, this is what we need to do. My boss would look at the deck and say, okay, so why are you not doing it?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I wanted you to agree. So that's why I prepared this. It's like, no, just go and do it. Yeah. Don't put decks together. Just do it. So that was a bit of a wake-up call of, the value is in a lot of it. Most of it is in doing it, not in thinking about what you need to do is important, but not sort of spending a whole bunch of time trying to convince people to do it. Yeah, so it was an exciting time at AOL. It was before Time Warner. Remember one morning I'm driving to AOL. This was in Dulles, Virginia. I lived in DC. And I heard on the news that, it was really a purchase, but, there was a merger between AOL and Time Warner. And a lot of us were scratching our heads at AOL. What? Really? Why? And obviously the idea back then was that content was going to be king, and that
they were right.
Yeah, and well, not really. No, I don't think so. So content was going to be king, but they had brands like Time Inc. and all of that, which ended up not being important at all, and we tried very hard because I was in some of the teams to do the merger and get all the synergies. And what happened is, content is king, but user-generated content became a big deal. Interactions, and people thought of content being consumed in a very passive way back then, and they thought that's what was going to win, and the rest of it was just going to be, infrastructure leading to that content. Well, not so. But AOL bought at a time just before the crash of 2000, in March 2000, if you remember. Yeah. What happened is, the company found itself in a situation that was much tougher than the environment they had before. A lot of the people that had made a lot of money retired. And it was great for me, not from a financial perspective, but it was great for me because it presented a whole bunch of opportunity for people like me in the company. So I was promoted very quickly. I was basically in charge of transforming their advertising business from one that was these big deals that were not working, that were sort of this promise of all kinds of things, good things were going to happen. So I had to restructure those deals. Then there was a big a lot of the internal businesses of AOL required what we call, ad inventory to survive, but that inventory had an opportunity cost and they were not returning it. So I ended up being in charge of that. And then I ended up being in charge of the advertising business. Not from a sales perspective, but I was kind of, best I could describe it was the CEO of the advertising business. So I had the technology part, the operations part, the pricing, the product part. And that was a big transformation to go from these deals to a real advertising business. And so we had a couple of things that we did at the time. We acquired a company called advertising.com. There's performance advertising. We have a lot of performance advertisers, so we could put them all in there. And then we did a deal and shaped their product with DoubleClick to be, or sort of advertising technology to serve big brands. And then when I left, this was a business that was, instead of being these large businesses of multi-million-dollar businesses with big deals that didn't perform, we had your normal advertising business, which was run-of-the-mill sort of campaigns that were much smaller, but that were repetitive and were judged as such. And so that was a successful run for me. At the end of that, what I really wanted to do was, I did all this transformation. It was great. I went from director to SVP at AOL. And I thought, oh, terrific. But then I went to one of my mentors at the time, Ted Leonsis, and I said, the owner of the Capitals and a pretty well-known person in the business world. And I said, look, I'd love to run a business. I want full P&L. And he said to me, well, that's great, but the CEO job is not available because that's where it all went. You couldn't really, there's no other place where you owned a P&L and all the operations.
Right.
That's when I decided, oh, look, I'd love to try something else. I'd love to try something smaller too, because AOL was a company that it was just difficult to operate in. The processes, it was very political, might not be the right word, but like it's just hard to get stuff because the organization, the accountability was not very clear. Yeah. And so I said, let's go to something smaller. And that's how I found Rosetta Stone. But AOL was, for me, if you think McKinsey was a great is a great way to get educated on business and CEO type issues. AOL for me was the really quick and dirty operating learning curve. I basically was in an operating role and I was left alone to deal with all these things. And I took on more. So for me, that was the forming years from an operating perspective, and it ended up being a great time, even though it was hard. I worked very hard, but it was a really good thing for my career, I thought, in terms of learning.
I mean, it just, it was the best performing stock in the 1990s, I think. And so
unfortunately, not when I was there. The stock when I joined was at 85 or something like that. And then it split and it went all the way to 99. And so in my first 6 months, I'm like, oh, okay, maybe this might turn out to be a good thing. But then the Time Warner thing happened. The internet fell off the chart. Like Yahoo lost 90% of their value. eBay lost 90% of their value. We, by the way, at AOL could have acquired all these companies. The Time Warner board said, no, we gotta focus on the integration of Time Warner. But not afterwards. That after 2000, the stock was not the best performing stock of the 2000s. It was not.
Yeah, I agreed. But I guess the thing about AOL, I mean, it's a little bit of a joke. People still have their AOL emails or whatever, and as their primary email. And
not my primary, but I still have.
I do too, and I'm trying to kill it off. And it's amazing how many different places still have it. So, but I mean, it was the high flyer, right? I mean, the fact that it pulled off that Time Warner deal, and they set the foundations for a lot of what ultimately became the next generation, which was Google. And just in terms of the advertising model and all of that. And they got killed along with a lot of other companies by that massive down period.
It was interesting because there were very formative years for the internet and what it became, right? A lot of companies were born out of that 2000, like Facebook was born out of that, Google was born out of that, and Google did a big deal with Google where we got warrants into Google that turned out to be $3 billion for AOL. But at the time, those were small companies. Like nobody thought. Amazon was just starting to. At some point, they came to AOL and said, we want to sell books. And AOL said, what? Are you crazy? So a lot of these companies were born out of that crisis and in that period of time in the early 2000s. So
it's very true. And it's just, I mean, the advertising part of the industry is just, it's massive.
It's interesting because back then, out of the advertising group that we have at AOL, there were like 3 or 4 people that went to found companies that became very important in redefining what advertising became. So all these marketplaces for advertising and all of these things were founded out of a lot of the people at DoubleClick. DoubleClick had a number of people that became very important in redefining it. And by the way, DoubleClick obviously was acquired by Google and it became their advertising business, except for the search business. It was their advertising business. They're the most important infrastructure and provider of services in advertising today. And that continues to be the case. So all of that came from that period of trouble and transformation in the early 2000s.
But for you, as you said, you went to Rosetta Stone, then you went to Living Social. You were COO there too. And then you got your first CEO job at Criteo. How did that come about? And what was it like being a first-time CEO?
Rosetta Stone was interesting because it's a company that was at the beginning of growth, but didn't have a lot of the infrastructure. We put that in place and then we took it public. So that was a great experience. And then I jumped over to Living Social, which was in the same business as Groupon. And that was a tremendous experience in that there was so much money flowing in that space. We grew that company very rapidly. I remember I had international at 20 people in London, and the board said, okay, you're number 2 in the US, you're good to go, grow international. And we went from 20 people in London to 3,000 people in 16 countries or 17 countries.
Wow.
Like a year. It was crazy. And we said no to many companies. And, there was a very good rationale for it, but then the money stopped. I had to close half the companies I had acquired, like within the last 3 months. And so it was this sort of creative disruption type thing that I had never lived through at the speed that it went through. So I think that was all a great experience for me, for being in smaller companies like Rosetta Stone, Living Social, and seeing it grow. And Criteo came to me at a time when their growth in Europe, which was their biggest market, this was, advertising technology, so retargeting mostly, so using the data from e-commerce companies that collect from people to serve ads to bring them back to buy stuff on their site. Their growth had stagnated in Europe. The board said, okay, we need to figure out a way to find another business from the assets that we have. And I was brought into as CRO to run their traditional business of retargeting. And very quickly, I saw that they did not have a go-to-market that was scalable. Their compensation plans were not adapted to what they need to be. They didn't think that they should do mid-market, which ended up being 30% of the revenue. The US was not growing. It was only 8% of the company. And so once we fixed all of that, we started having growth again. And then on the tech side, we also had, at the time, a lot of tech debt. So we could not evolve the product. And so we hired a guy from Google, came in. He said, okay, Eric, I need you to take the red pill. I don't remember from the Matrix. So one is like, basically you can't do anything in terms of features for 9 months, and we were being killed by competitors. And we did that. There were enough initiatives on the go-to-market side to drive growth so we could take the company public. We took it public. I quickly went from CRO to COO. And then the founder, who had come back to Europe from California to run the company, said, okay, Eric, you run today. I'm going to go back. And then we had tremendous growth. Japan became our second largest country. We had a deal with Yahoo Japan that was phenomenal. And so we grew the company from 300 million to over 2.4 billion dollars in revenue. So that was very rapid growth. And I became CEO, was it in 2000, at the end of 2015. Founder took a step back. He went to be the chairman of the board, and I took that role. So at the time, we had become a public company, very successful in the market in terms of the revenues and the financial results, probably not as, we ended up being at some point, $3-4 billion company. So that was great on the NASDAQ. But we were always, the financial markets always considered that Criteo had the problem or the risk of Facebook, Google, and Apple changing the rules of the game, because they controlled, how you track data. And at some point, Apple did. So they didn't allow you to track data across sites. And so that was a problem for us. We continued to grow, but our growth slowed down dramatically. So while I was at Criteo, we started a pivot to what we call retail media. And I think now it's part of 40% of their business. We bought a company, HookLogic, in New York that was doing retail media. And this was really, if you're an e-commerce company, you're Walmart, which was a client at the time. But if you're an e-commerce company, it's not enough to make money on the goods you sell. That's very thin. You need to make money. It's a famous flywheel from Amazon advertising. So we basically were helping them make money from performance advertising on their sites. And that, we knew it was going to turn to be also a business where we could provide the tools for them to make money, not just on performance advertising, but on brand advertising. So we made that pivot at the time and started growing that business. And so I was CEO for 2.5 years at Criteo, and then left. The founder had done a couple of things in California and decided to come back to Europe and convince the board, okay, I want to be the CEO again, and I said, okay, well, if that's the case, I'm going to go off and do something different. But Criteo was a phenomenal experience. Like I literally, I moved to London with my family from DC, sold our house. It was a big risk. I didn't realize it at the time, because when I arrived and I saw all the problems that Criteo had, I thought the company was doing great. And when I arrived there, it's like no growth. Fortunately, there were lots of things that could be done to accelerate growth. So, maybe a little bit of luck here and there, and some sort of experience that I brought allowed me to be successful there. But, I could have turned out differently. Who knows? So, but it turned out to be a great story. I learned a lot. And I was running, a company that had 2,500 employees, of which almost 1,000 were in France. So it was a very international role. We had our second country in terms of employees was the US, obviously, with about 500 employees. So it was very truly international. And after leaving social, which was, even though I had, I bought all these companies all over the world, Criteo was truly sort of, the center of gravity was very much in Europe. Even though from a go-to-market perspective and from a lot of the relationships that we need to have with companies in the ecosystems, it was very US-centric. So it was a truly global role with centers of excellence in the US and Western Europe. And so, great experience for me. It was terrific. And I loved London. The family loved London. They didn't like it at the beginning. I was not a popular person at home, but then they loved it. Even today, I went with my oldest to London 4 weeks back, and she just loves the city, and they have all these really memories from it. So it ended up a great experience for us. Yeah.
And then you went into online dating.
Yeah. So this is interesting, because I thought I was going to stay in B2B e-commerce, and I had a couple of opportunities that ended up not working out, mostly because those companies wanted me to move to Texas or to other places, and the family was done with moves, so I was not about to move on my own. And so I took this opportunity, Spark Networks, which was a portfolio of online dating brands, mostly targeted at sort of an older. It's not targeted at the young generation like Tinder or others, but more sort of, some of the brands will tell you this, silver singles. We also had brands like Christian Mingle. So it was three companies that were put together and had not really been integrated. And it was a real turnaround. And I thought, why not? And I have been in consumer technology in the past. Rosetta Stone is a good example. Leaving Social is a good example at AOL, in a lot of the channels. And so I thought, why not? It's interesting. Lots of new things. The company based out of Berlin, Germany, traded on the New York Stock Exchange, but also, with an infrastructure in terms of corporate infrastructure in Germany. So that added a whole bunch of complexity. And when I arrived at the company was about to go bankrupt. I didn't realize it too. They told me, no problem. This is, subscription business. All the revenues are in. But I arrived in December, and I'm like, oh boy, we're not going to have any cash at the end of December. So my first thing, this was like completely different experience for me. Like a company struggling, and you didn't have like 3 weeks to analyze things. You need to figure out a way to keep it operating. And so we had to cost a lot at the beginning. And then this was in 2020, the pandemic hit. And like many people, we thought, oh, this is just going to be a three-month thing. I had to operate, based in the US, company where the majority of the staff was in Berlin. And the pandemic was pretty good for us at the beginning, because online dating took off because people were stuck at home. And if you're single, you're alone. That was the best with people. So that gave us some room to integrate the company. We had acquired a brand called Zusk, California-based company that was declining. We were able to turn around, in particular, the product. They had not invested in the product quite a bit. We tried to restructure the debt, which was, at the time they had sort of raised debt to buy Zusk before I arrived. And the debt sort of terms were quite difficult, because they went to somebody that was mostly specializing in or specialized in distressed situations. So that was all new to me, like debt. And, I was used to dealing with shareholders, but not debt holders. boy, they can be very difficult, in particular if you're not doing as well as they think you should be doing. So we tried to restructure the debt in the first year of the pandemic. We couldn't do that because all debt companies were restructuring their portfolios because everything was going in all kinds of directions. But it gave us a little bit of time to sort of turn around the company. I had to basically change all the management in the company. So it's again like a real sort of turnaround situation where you have to sort of take drastic actions right and left. And we ended up sort of restructuring the debt. We got Zusk, this brand, to start performing well. And, I give you this example also of the situation. We would close our audits 6 months after the year end because they had not integrated the systems. Everything was manual. And we had an auditor that was used to dealing with large companies. And so, they just, treat us as a large company. So there were like all kinds of issues in this company, but we got it back. We were able in 2024, in 2022, at the beginning of 22, we restructured the debt. And with the board, we decided, okay, let's put the company up for sale. Bad year to sell companies, 2022. We're not able, that process was not successful. So I ended up leaving the company, and then, the company ended up sort of in the hands of the debt holders. So for me, it was fascinating experience. I tell you, it's just, something I had not seen, and all these movements. We had activist investors going after the company. It was very interesting. I think it was a lot of learning for me. It was very stressful time. And one of these, Criteo had a good sort of product market fit. They just hadn't sort of optimized the elements to start growth again. These guys had problems with the products. They had a corporate structure that was very difficult. That was kind of a structural issue for the company. And then also the other thing that was tough is that after the pandemic, I thought, okay, well, people are not going to be stuck inside, but they're going to want to date people. So, it's going to be a wash. And actually the market sort of fell, and guys like Match, their stock price went down 80%. And so we tried to sell in that environment. It wasn't the best, but I don't regret it at all. I thought it was a great experience, met great people, and had a blast, even though it was very stressful as an experience.
So you've been a CEO for 8-9 years at this point. What do you know now that you wish you had known when you started at Criteo in your first days as a CEO?
Yeah, I think one of the things that it's maybe an early lesson at Criteo, the business environment is always messy. It's always a bit of the fog of war. You don't know. And as a CEO, even if you're not sure of the direction, you got to make sure that the company is very clear on where you're going. And I think in the early days at Criteo, I wanted to keep my options open. So, we would have a strategy, but we would be, but we can, depending on the environment, if things change. So I think one of the clear things, if you're the CEO of the company, you need to be very clear about what you're doing for the company. Even if you're not completely sure, you can always change afterwards if there's good reasons, but you need to get everybody sort of going in the same direction to make sure you have a chance. So that was one thing. I think another thing that's important is, I learned this at different places, but prioritizing is super important. I can't stress how much, for example, at Criteo, there were so many shiny objects along the way, but we were clear that the retargeting market was a huge market. And so we had to kill things and take things away and make sure people knew that that's what we're going after. I find that was the same thing in every company I went to. If you leave it up to the company, there's always going to be thousands of initiatives that bloom. And not that it's a bad thing. You want to encourage sort of thinking, but you can't have a company working on 10 things at the same time. You really have to prioritize, because to get things done right and to finish them on time, it's hard enough. If you have too many things, you really can't do that. So I think it's really important, one, to be very clear about what you're doing, and then not let sort of all these ideas, and in particular, if you start doing well, that's when the pressure of sort of trying a whole bunch of new things comes in. And I would say that was the second very important thing. And then the third, if you feel that people are not performing, make the changes quickly. So if keeping a person in place that's not performing for whatever reason, maybe the person just lost interest or just they were put in a job that was not their thing, that just sends such a bad message to other people in the company and creates a really sort of terrible environment. So, you want people that are positive, you want people that are pushing forward, and where the rest of the company sees that as, oh, this is the example that we need to follow. And so I think if the third thing would say is just, if you feel as you come in that you have to make changes in people, just make them sooner rather than later, because that can come back and haunt you. It becomes harder and harder and harder to make those changes the more time goes by, because you find ways and things that sort of say, oh, well, I can wait a little bit more. Oh, this person is doing this part of the job well, even though the other person. Yeah. So I think that's a really important message that you need to send. And frankly, as a CEO, people expect you. Yep. Maybe they don't expect you sort of, they don't think, okay, this person needs to make these changes, but it's understood that you're there to make things better, because otherwise, what are you doing, right? And sometimes it's rare that making things better doesn't go through changes in personnel. So make those changes as quickly as you can, and accept mistakes. If you make a mistake, no matter what, accept them as quickly, and sort of, they say hire slowly and fire quickly. That's in one area, but also in strategy. If something doesn't work, don't try to keep it going for a long time to justify that was a good idea. If you made a mistake, be humble and say, that was a mistake. Let's move on. That's a quality that sometimes sort of is not there in companies. People sort of have initiatives that take on a life of their own and use resources and attention of the company that should be spent somewhere else. So those would be some of the things that come to mind.
I mean, you got to be okay with failure, and you have to be willing to kind of move on.
Yeah.
One last question for people who are listening, what advice would you give them about how to get the most out of their career?
I can talk about my experience and what were moments that I think made a big difference. I think jumping a bit into situations that were unknown is where I grew the most. So AOL is a great example. Living Social was a great example too, where there were risky situations. Criteo was a risky situation. I moved my whole family not knowing what was going to transpire, and it ended up working. But you should take those risks, right? Because if you don't, you're just not going to grow. That's where you get the most growth, is just being in different situations and trying new things. I find that it's easier to do that when you're younger, because as you get older, you have more and more constraints, family constraints, financial constraints of what you can and cannot do. So, try that. And I would say, it depends. It depends on your personality. Sometimes people love to try new things, but I would say also try new industries. And, I was fortunate enough to be in industries that were growing, and the market in general were growing. So if you can do that, better to be in a so-so company in a market that's growing than to be in a terrific company in a declining market. So I would also choose areas that have growth and are seeing, even if it's uncertain, that sort of have potential, because those are generally more exciting, lead to maybe less sort of stable situations, but more opportunity. With, AOL was a lot of opportunity. Criteo was a lot of opportunity. And some of these other companies, the turnarounds were not as much. Well, there I got a lot of learning. It's a new situation. And so I went to online dating, not knowing anything about it. I'd been married for over 25 years. So I didn't know anything about online dating when I joined, except for the match deal that we did at AOL, 20 years before. But just take a leap. The worst that can happen is you'll learn a lot and you'll go again and look for something new. The best that can happen is you end up sort of, being in a situation where the company grows a lot and you grow along with it. So take some risky, particularly when you're younger. Try a lot of things. You never know what you're going to like too. Everybody performs better doing something that they love. So
absolutely.
So those would be the things that at least I've experienced. I don't know if that's, you can write that in a book and say that's the way to go, because everybody's different. But
Good. Hey, thanks for doing this. It's fun to catch up.
You're welcome. Yeah, same here. All right. Thank you, JR. Have a good night.
I want to thank Eric for joining me today to discuss his career journey, what he's learned along the way, his guidance for aspiring leaders, and just more generally about how to think about your career. If you're ready to take control of your career, visit pathwise.io. If you'd like more regular career insights, you can become a member. It's free. You can also sign up on the website for the Pathwise newsletter and follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Career Sessions, Career Lessons. We hope the nuggets of wisdom shared today help guide your path to the successful career of your dreams. This podcast series is part of Pathwise.io, which is here to help you live the career you want. We provide a comprehensive mix of career and professional development events, insights, tools, and exercises backed by a group of leading coaches and other career management experts. If you aspire to something more or just something different in your career, join us at Pathwise.io. You can find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. See you again on the next episode.